All right, Radley, it's great to chat with you today. Um, I'm
Here.
here at Liberty headquarters here in Washington, D.C. at the Cato Institute, surrounded by all of our libertarian library here. Where are you right now in the world?
I'm at home in Nashville, Tennessee.
Excellent. For those who don't know, Radley is an award-winning independent investigative journalist. He's written a couple of great books, The Cadaver King and The Country Dentist and The Rise of the Warrior Cop. But we're here to discuss his latest feature for the New Republic magazine, the Trump's Immigration Nightmare. It is happening here. And first, Radley, let me congratulate you. This is an excellent overview of what the Trump administration is attempting to do with its immigration policy. When I first saw that you had written an article about ICE, though, I must say my initial thought was that you were going to take the angle that basically, hey, immigration advocates, welcome to my world. This is what we're seeing on the streets in America across the country. And now you're just getting exposed to it in your small slice of the policy world. In fact, you write, I've been writing and reporting on policing in the United States for more than 20 years. I've spent much of that time writing about the effects of police militarization, but I've never seen anything quite like the last 6 months. Why don't we back up just a bit and lay the groundwork? What has been happening with police in the United States in the last few years? What have you been seeing? What were you tracking before all of this happened with ICE? And now what's different? What is ICE building on and kind of going beyond even the most egregious stuff that you've been seeing before?
Yeah, so what we've seen over the last probably 40 years is a gradual kind of militarization of police in America. This it was primarily done through the drug war in the 80s and 90s. But we saw a massive proliferation of SWAT teams across the country, an increased use of SWAT teams, not for active shooter situations or hostage situations or these kinds of emergency situations for which they were designed, but increasingly used, and in some places almost exclusively used, to serve warrants on people suspected of drug crimes. And that was really an escalation of that kind of force and violence. You went from, an active shooter situation where someone was in the process of committing a violent crime, right? And you're using violence to overwhelm that person and save lives, to using this kind of force and violence on people who are still only suspected of nonviolent consensual crimes, right? These are drug investigations. You haven't even charged someone yet. You're still investigating that you do the SWAT raid to try to find evidence. And this was a gradual thing that happened, over the course of about a generation. Ample contributions from both parties. We then see it really get ramped up again after September 11th with the creation of DHS. Then you start getting these grants to local police departments to buy military grade, militaristic type equipment. And with all this gear and training, you also see kind of a change in police culture and police mindset, where officers start to see themselves as soldiers, not as peace officers. They start to take a very kind of us versus them mentality. So there's the stuff that's a problem with militarization, but there's also kind of the culture and the mentality. And for a long time in this country, we've had a kind of a firewall between the military and civilian policing. And the reason for that is that a soldier's job is very different from a police officer's job. And it's dangerous to conflate the two. And so what I had argued, up until the last 10 months or so, is that, we'd done a good job of preventing the military from doing domestic policing, and that's a tradition that goes back to the founding, of course. Where we kind of dropped the ball is we've allowed police to become more like the military. And I would argue that if a soldier's sort of skill set is inappropriate for domestic policing, that's true whether it's an actual soldier or whether it's a cop that we've, dressed like, trained like, armed like, and has adopted the mentality of a soldier. So that's kind of, where things were headed, I think.
So, what are you seeing from ICE now? I mean, when I think back about immigration policy, really, I've been working on immigration policy since 2011. I've been writing on this subject for you know throughout that entire period, and the idea that I would be spending so much of my time researching questions of Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment issues. I mean, these are far afield from what should the visa policy of the United States be? How should we allow someone to get vetted and come here and live here? And what should the protocols be when Border Patrol arrests someone? Or these are the types of questions that most dominated immigration policy before this year. And now it's really, what are the basic rights of Americans, and what is the duty of law enforcement in this field to those people? And so, what do you see has changed, and what is the difference between what happened before and what's happening right now with ICE?
So I think Trump really kind of changed the debate on police militarization. In some ways, may have just outright ended it. I think when I would debate this issue with people mostly on the right over the last 20 years or so, there was always this kind of shared understanding, at least, that that we don't want the military doing domestic policing. Right? The question was always about um, whether it was appropriate for police to be using this kind of force and violence, or when it was appropriate for them to be using it. Um, Trump has kind of shifted the debate to where the other side is basically now saying, there's nothing wrong with using the military for domestic policing. We're gonna toss that kind of founding principle that goes, back to the effects of the Boston Massacre and British troops in the streets of Boston. We're just going to scrap that, and Trump wants to put the military everywhere. He wants to put the National Guard in cities that didn't vote for him, cities where he claims crime is out of control in spite of all the available evidence. He said he wants to put active duty troops in these cities. He did that in Los Angeles. And the way the drug war was kind of the impetus for police militarization in the 80s and 90s, immigration has become kind of the foot in the door for this administration to really kind of ramp up, and obliterate kind of this line, this firewall that we've had for 250 years. I'm not telling you anything, but in Los Angeles, the whole reason he got to deploy the military was because he claimed that immigration officers weren't able to do their jobs, and so the claim was that protests were interfering with immigration enforcement. Therefore, we have to send the National Guard and the Marines. Now he's hedged a little bit on that, and he tried to use crime as an excuse in Chicago, but right back in Minneapolis, we're back to immigration again. And I think we're having this conversation the day after the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis. I think there is a real danger of Minneapolis blowing up again the way it did after George Floyd, and frankly, I think the administration wants that. I mean, I think Trump wants to put troops in Minneapolis. So again, we have an immigration enforcement officer committing an act of violence that will trigger protests, which then will enable this administration to kind of do what they've wanted to do all along.
So it's interesting, when I'm reading your article, it's more than just a list of terrible things that this administration is doing, or that ICE is doing, or it is, you have an overarching theory about why this is happening. And it's not, just, well, the administration's okay with some bad stuff happening. It's more deliberate in your view. So could you expand a little bit more on that? Actually, you have a quote in here. I'll read it. The administration has toppled the most cherished pillars of a free society. We've seen rapid normalization of abuses we once associated with authoritarian regimes or the old Iron Curtain countries. Why is that? What is driving that? That is not an accident in your view. So why do you? What's the theory that you see guiding some of the stuff that we're seeing on the streets?
I think it's as simple as Trump wants to be an authoritarian. I mean, he has long expressed his admiration of and fondness for strongmen around the world. You can go back to the mid 80s in his interview with Playboy magazine, where he praised the violent crackdown on Tiananmen Square as an example of strength, and contrasted it to the U.S., where he said we're too weak with protests. He's praised, Erdogan, Putin. I mean, he's praised every dictator in the world, pretty much. I mean, the list goes on and on. He has also long wanted to have his own kind of muscle, his own paramilitary force that he can kind of drop in on his enemies and to intimidate them and to silence them. We know that in 2020, during the George Floyd protests in D.C., that he wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act and bring active duty military in to put down the protests. He, according to Mark Esper, repeatedly asked why we couldn't just bring in soldiers to shoot the protesters. Now, to be fair, he wanted to shoot them in the legs, not the head. But this alarmed everybody around him to the point where, Esper and Milley both, threatened to resign if he invoked the Insurrection Act. We also saw we've seen over the course of his first and second term and in between, this constant reference on social media to the bikers, cops, and soldiers that will, come to his aid if he needs them to, right? And of course, we saw this on January 6th. So, I think this is just a matter of Trump wants to be able to do what he wants, when he wants, where he wants. He wants to be able to carry out retribution against his enemies, and he wants a force that will kind of do what he says when he wants them to. And that is, basically what they've created. I mean, if you look at Stephen Miller and what he was saying during the 2024 campaign and during the 4 years in between the two administrations, he was quite clear about the fact that they had a plan, and that plan implemented by people like Russ Vought was to eliminate anyone in the federal government, anyone in bureaucracy who's going to stand in their way. They would purge the federal government of institutionalists, of people who have fidelity to the Constitution. I mean, Trump has been criticizing the Federalist Society because it's people, at DOJ and on the federal courts are too, too woke apparently, or too milquetoast. They're not carrying out his will on command. So I don't think there's any real kind of underlying ideology. I don't think Trump really has an ideology. I think it's about him, and it's about him flexing his power. Now, I do think Stephen Miller has an ideology. I think Russ Vought has an ideology, and it's pretty clear that Miller's ideology is a country that, has no more black and brown immigrants. I mean, he's been pretty explicit about it. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I don't think that's unfair. I think he has been pretty upfront about the fact that he wants, particularly when it comes to refugees, the only refugees we're going to be taking in are white South Africans, and everybody else, you're out of luck. He's also, H-1B visas for tech workers, upper income people. He doesn't want that either, because they tend to come from South Asian countries. It is really about race, and I think so. You've got Trump wanting what Trump wants, and then you've got underneath them people who have, I think, some really vile ideologies that they're using Trump to carry out.
When I look at it, how is this plan being carried out on a sort of systematic basis? This shouldn't happen in a free country. We have the Constitution to protect us from a totalitarian state. And so when you think about what needs to happen in each step, you just referenced the firing of the institutionalists. That's sort of what you might describe as the deep state protection. The fact that there are just some people in our bureaucracy that just don't want to go along with totalitarianism. Well, he's firing all those people, and he's actually firing them at ICE and replacing them with people who are willing to go along with the extreme measures that he wants. Well, really, Miller is the one doing it operationally, but President Trump and Stephen Miller are purging that bureaucracy of any opposition. They've destroyed the inspector general at office at DHS. So there's no kind of internal review for anything that's happening. Its legality is rubber stamped. And so that's sort of the first stage of trying to protect them from any kind of oversight, constitutional protection, any kind of limit on what the agency is going to do. So we get rid of that. So now all these ICE agents, everyone there is on board with the agenda, which is, as you described, to go out and purge the population of the undesirables. Those include people who are here illegally, but also people who are here legally, and then go out and use methods to accomplish that goal that are in violation of the Constitution. So walk us through the parts of your article where you kind of document and explain to people, look, you would think the Constitution is here to protect us. The rule of law is here. There's actually, even just the immigration law itself has protections for due process. So, start with the immigration law piece of it, perhaps. The immigration courts, they're supposed to operate in a way to protect due process. And then, talk about some of the constitutional checks that are supposed to be in place to prevent this from happening.
Yeah. So today I actually, on my newsletter, I published one of the interviews I did for the New Republic article. I published the entire interview, and it was with a fired immigration judge, one that Trump fired, then George Pappas, who worked in Massachusetts. And, what he describes is just this kind of relentless campaign of intimidation and humiliation. He said that the DOJ office that oversees the immigration court started putting out these memos that were just, accused the judges of being unprofessional, unethical, biased. There was relentless pressure on them to rule against asylum seekers without even granting a hearing. There was a lot of emphasis placed on efficiency, getting through your docket as quickly as possible. At the same time, they had to read all these memos that the Office of Immigration, EOIR, I believe it's called, was putting out. They also got the Doge memo, so they had to submit their weekly, here's what I accomplished in the last week memo. They also fired all the advisory attorneys that these judges, rely on to reach their decisions in these cases. And a lot of them who weren't fired left voluntarily because they kind of saw where things were headed. And so there was just this kind of relentless pressure to toe the line. And if you didn't, you look, and some of the judges that were fired actually, had a much higher rate of denying asylum than the average judge. And one of them who was fired told me when I interviewed her for this article, just that I think I was fired because they wanted to show that it could happen to anyone, right? It doesn't really matter what your record is. So you better, toe the line and do what we want. Pappas, though, he just describes a really kind of miserable, experience. I believe it was in May, the administration started this tactic, which you've written a lot about, of dismissing the charges in an asylum case, and then which then sort of removes the protections that come with somebody who's in the asylum process, then arresting them outside the courtroom and putting them into expedited removal, which removes a lot of the due process protections that they would get. Pappas was told to grant those requests by the government without a hearing, just grant them sort of routinely, rotely. And he refused. And that probably is what, eventually led to his firing. So, there's this hollowing out of the immigration courts. And, as you well know, the immigration courts have never really been courts. They've always been under the purview of the Justice Department. That has always been pretty suspect in terms of, their ability to mete out justice. There's been an effort to make them sort of more independent prior to this administration. But when the attorney general is the person who, I don't know, she literally signs the paychecks, but that's who the paychecks come from. There's always going to be kind of that subtle pressure. There's always going to be the appearance of, that these courts aren't fully independent. So can we really trust what they do? But Trump really just kind of dispensed with even the pretense of justice, right? During his first term, I think he appointed a few judges after vacancies that were pretty far right, pretty like out there, very much outside the norm for that kind of a position. Biden fired a couple of them, which, may have been questionably legal. I don't know. But Republicans were really upset about that, claiming that, this was a violation of executive power, or that Biden abuses power. Biden fired, I think, a half dozen. Trump has already fired over 100. He also has hollowed out the Bureau of Immigration Appeals, which handles appeals, replaced about a third of that board. So, it's just this, like everything else, it's this attempt to, he doesn't think there should be any independent agency that can think for itself, right? Everything has to be sort of bent to his will. So that's what we're seeing in the courts. And as a result of that, we are seeing, people are not getting their hearings. They are being denied. A lot of times I've talked to defense attorneys in immigration, who weren't even made aware of where in the country their clients were being held until they were already on a plane. They'd already been deported. They're being routinely denied calls with attorneys. These are people who have already retained counsel, not being able to contact their attorneys. The conditions in these facilities are inhumane. They're horrific. And the administration has been really upfront about this. That's all intentional. Like, what they want is to make coming to this country and seeking refuge here such a miserable experience that no one will want to do it. They want to make people suffer. That is part of the plan. And when you are talking about deporting millions of people, up to 1 million people a year, I think is what Miller wants. You're talking about housing them in abandoned shopping malls and warehouses, and you don't care what kind of conditions they're in. And you've also hollowed out all of the bureaucratic means of oversight. I mean, they destroyed the office within ICE that is supposed to enforce humane conditions in ICE detention centers. That office doesn't exist anymore either. I talked to somebody from that office. It's a recipe for atrocities. I mean, it's a recipe for mass death, mass suffering. And I think that is where we are headed. I'm getting a really long answer, but let me move on quickly to the constitutional issues that aren't embedded in that. And that is that the way ICE is enforcing these laws. After George Floyd, we had a big kind of national discussion about qualified immunity, which is the immunity given to state and local police. So if they violate your constitutional rights, shoot you, detain you, illegally search you, there is, under the Ku Klux Klan Act, which was passed after the Civil War, there's a way for you to sue them in federal court. I would argue that it's much too difficult to sue them in federal court. There are a lot of protections they have, but you can at least do it in theory. Federal law enforcement officers have almost complete immunity. They are not subject to civil liability under the Ku Klux Klan Act. They're subject to liability under a decision from the 1970s called Bivens, in which the court created a way for people to sue federal law enforcement officers for constitutional violations. The court has since been chipping away at Bivens, and basically in 2022, they basically all but overturned it. In fact, I think it was Gorsuch, in a concurring opinion, said, why don't we just admit what we're doing here and say Bivens is gone? So there's really no good way to hold federal law enforcement officers accountable when they commit abuse. And so you have an administration now that where you have a president who has been told by the Supreme Court that he cannot be held criminally liable for virtually anything he does in office. You have everybody underneath him who has shown that they are willing to violate the law and the Constitution in order to carry out his agenda. And then you go all the way down to the people on the ground, the foot soldiers for this administration, and ICE and Border Patrol and DHS, who have this almost complete immunity from any type of civil liability. Technically, maybe they could be held criminally accountable for incidents like we saw in Minneapolis, but that if it's going to happen at the federal level, it required Trump's Justice Department to bring criminal charges. Not going to happen. And for it to be done locally, they're going to have to fight DOJ every step of the way, basically. So you have an entire sort of enforcement mechanism throughout the executive branch where no one can expect to face any sort of accountability. You have a president telling ICE and Border Patrol officers that they are unleashed, that they are uncuffed, who has celebrated police abuse and police violence in the past, and has told them that the people that they're targeting are something less than human, right? That they poison the blood of the country or they're vermin. He's told them, yes, Renee Good, who was killed yesterday by the ICE officer, may have been recording ICE. Like maybe she was recording on her cell phone. We're not even sure she was doing that. We're not even sure she was an activist. She may have just been in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. But it's not surprising that an ICE officer would react violently to someone recording them, because Stephen Miller and Trump and other people in the administration have flat out said that people who record ICE officers are domestic terrorists, that this is an example of domestic terrorism. That is an absurd, as you've written about this at length, an absurd, preposterous, absolutely insane thing to say. And yet, it clearly has an effect on the officers on the ground who interact with these people on a daily basis. They are not citizens with rights. They are not residents with rights. They are potential terrorists, right? And what do you do with potential terrorists? Well, you arrest them, you kill them.
This really goes back to the idea of an invasion, right? We were invaded under the Biden administration, and in their worldview, people came to this country, and that to them is an invasion. It's certainly once you use that rhetoric, what do you do to invaders? What do you do to people who invade your country? Well, that requires a military response, and that is what the explicit argument that has been made by Stephen Miller for many of these actions is this was an invasion. We need a response that's not a law enforcement response. This is not about law enforcement or enforcing the law. This is a response to an invasion, and invaders don't get due process. Invaders don't get any kind of protection against, unlawful detention and seizure, and even being shot. Seemingly would be on the table if it really was an invasion. Now, of course, there's a big difference between the rhetorical invasion and a real one. A real invasion looks like what happened in Venezuela. With our military, it looks like what's happening in Ukraine with the Russian military. It doesn't look like a bunch of people coming here to supply us with more homes and more food and other things that they're doing in the labor market. But when I think about the big picture here, it is a situation where we want to create a police force in the United States with absolute power, above the law, independent from any kind of oversight, and totally immune to any kind of accountability on the back end. And so when you look at what has happened in a positive direction at state and local policing, what has protected us from having mass local police, unnamed and unaccountable? What has prevented this descent into tyrannical territory over time, and how can we apply maybe some of those lessons to this situation? Or maybe we can't. And I think one of the big distinctions, maybe you can speak to this, is one is local, and so there's actually more of a connection with the community than what we see with ICE.
Yeah. Before I get to that, I want to address your invasion point, because I think it's an important one. In some ways, it is not really all that different than every effort to establish an authoritarian state we've seen, in the last 200 years, which is that, in order to establish that kind of state, you have to establish that you're at war. You have to dehumanize the enemy, the alleged enemy, so that people are willing to see people suffer. People are willing. You get past that kind of empathetic tendency that we have to give a shit, care about other people. But then you also have to convince the population that the threat we're facing is so great that they should be willing to give up their basic civil liberties. That this is basically an existential threat. And I do think that you are seeing that kind of rhetoric thrown a lot. I mean, we've been seeing that for a decade now, but you really see it on the right now with this idea of suicidal empathy, right? This idea that like caring about other people, like not wanting other people to suffer, not, taking glee and joy in, a mother of a 6-year-old, getting gunned down in the streets of Minneapolis, not celebrating that, which is what we've seen, across social media on the right, that is somehow an emotion or a human tendency that we need to avoid and eliminate. When you eliminate empathy, that's how you get humanitarian atrocities. I mean, that is textbook, authoritarianism. Now, to get to your question, so what has kind of worked at the state and local level? I think getting involved electorally has helped in a lot of areas. I mean, I think we've seen police chiefs picked by mayors who ran on policies of police reform, who have implemented a lot of these reforms successfully. We've had district attorneys run on less kind of law and order platforms and more about fairness and equity and a justice system that values rehabilitation over retribution. I know that there's been a bit of a backlash against some of the progressive prosecutors, but crime is down all over the country. We saw a spike during the pandemic. We can, lots of people can debate over what caused that spike, but the progressive prosecutors who were blamed for all that, a lot of them are still in office, and they were still in office. Now the crime has gone back down and is near historic lows. And so you want to jump in there.
This is true even in the deepest, reddest states, though. I mean, we don't even have masked police operating in Alabama or Louisiana. I mean, we basically have a universal norm, no matter what party or is in power, against having masked police jump out of vehicles and just grab people without explaining what they're doing. I mean, this is what we see every single day from Border Patrol and from ICE. And this norm is it's nowhere. It's basically we are seeing a situation in the United States where the federal government is coming in and overthrowing a universal norm, and they're doing it really without any kind of groundswell of, this was not something from the public that was like, we're demanding you be masked and we're demanding that you engage in this type of behavior where you're not explaining. There's no warrant, there's no explanation given to anyone. It's really the exact opposite of what you see even in the most extreme right-wing communities in the United States. The cop is still going to, as they're, trying to get a subject to comply, explain what's going on. I'm an officer. My name's Joe Smith. I'm from this department. We don't see any of that. We see the opposite. We see, I'm not going to explain who I am. I don't need to talk to you. And if anyone asks any questions, they get pushed, they get shoved, they get, if there is a cell phone nearby, that might get knocked to the ground. We've seen a lot of that happening. So for some reason, we have this universal norm. And I think maybe it goes back to what you were saying about the founders. The founders looked at the federal government as such a big threat because it's not tethered to anything in a specific community. They can come in and they're not accountable to the people that they're policing as a local police officer might be or feel that he is.
Yeah, and I think, look, the masking thing, I talked to lots of former law enforcement people for this article. I talked to people formerly in ICE, former ICE prosecutors. I talked to the former head of Border Patrol during the Biden administration. They are all absolutely mortified by the masking and a little bit perplexed by it too, at how quickly it happened and how easily it happened. About 15 years ago, I wrote about a story in Detroit where there was a drug raid on these two women, and it was a joint local federal task force, and all the officers were masked, which often happened during drug raids. That's the one area where you would sometimes see masked police. They wear these balaclavas when they would break in. And in this case, they got the wrong house and really terrorized these two women. They didn't leave badge numbers, but the women had evidence that they'd been raided, and they sued, and they got all the way to the federal appeals court, which acknowledged that what happened to them was a pretty grave injustice, that they were terrorized in their own home, that the police got the wrong home. But because they couldn't name the specific officers who were involved, they could not file this lawsuit. And at the same time, the federal court said, we are not going to force the DEA to tell you who was involved. You just have to sort of figure that out on your own. Now, I bring that up because, that decision, I believe it came down in at least 6 or 7 years ago, right? Now, if there was a law that was stopping law enforcement officers in the U.S. from masking themselves, that decision would not have come down the way it was, right? It is a norm. It's an idea that we do not want to live in a society where police can hide their identity, where there's no accountability, where they can kind of do whatever they want and hide behind this mask. That is what has kept that from happening. The fact that we are not going to allow it. I think your point about federal and local is a good one. I also think that when these officers want to do whatever they want, they know now that there's no civil liability for them. And Stephen Miller has made this clear over and over again. You have immunity. He said that, he keeps telling them that through Fox News and other outlets, that they have complete immunity to do whatever they want. So when there's no civil liability, when there's no danger of criminal charges, the only real way left to hold these officers accountable is through social pressure, right? It's if you see the guy you go to church with in one of these videos terrorizing an immigrant, maybe make him feel a little bit bad about himself when you see him. Maybe, if one of your relatives is in one of these videos, tearing a baby out of his mother's arms, maybe you're a little embarrassed by that. And I think the masking is a way. It's like one last kind of shield of immunity, right? It removes that one last way we have of holding these officers accountable. And I think it's notable and really condemnable that the Trump administration, not only isn't cracking down on the masking, but, is encouraging it. It's basically policy now.
Yeah, it's interesting that one of the Border Patrol agents who was unmasked in one of these raids, he was detaining a U.S. citizen. It became a major news story. People found out that, hey, their neighbor is involved in arresting U.S. citizens and racial profiling on the streets. They protested in front of his house. And then a few weeks later, he's arrested for intruding in a women's bathroom, drunk and disorderly conduct, and resisting the police officers who came to arrest him. He was shown on surveillance concealing a loaded weapon nearby. And the only reason we knew he was a Border Patrol agent is because he was unmasked. The only reason there was any kind of accountability in terms of, the public knowing that these are the people who are policing your neighborhood in the name of border security is because of the fact that he happened to not be wearing a mask when he did what he did. So I think that the masking, you're right, it's the last thing. If they get your name, then you would face social pressure to not be doing what you're doing.
That's part of the right's kind of larger thing too, right? Like, the censorship. There have been legitimate instances, I think, of censorship of the right, over the last 20, 25 years. But their definition of censorship has come to the point now where they want to be able to say whatever they want without any social consequences either. And I think that's what we're seeing kind of with ICE and with law enforcement, their approach to law enforcement in general. It's not even about what they can legally get away with anymore. It's like, we also have to support what they're doing, right? We have to, they can't face any consequences at all, including social.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look back at the initial effort to get the New York City Police Department to wear uniforms. This was hotly resisted by the police officers. So it's a long history. You go back, we had this divide between civilian and the military in terms of, how we enforce laws and protect our country. But even back then in the 19th century, it was commonplace to just have someone who was just a regular civilian. They weren't trained, and they would just go out and arrest someone. And the effort to get them in uniforms and trained was something that was resisted at the beginning, and eventually it became a norm because police saw it as a benefit that people know who I am. They respect my authority more, so they're not going to fight back as much as they would if just a random person accosts them on the streets. And we see that confusion play out so much with ICE and Border Patrol when they're grabbing people who are like, I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're law enforcement or not. The FBI, as you mentioned in your article, actually warned DHS about this problem, how they're creating this confusion about who's a criminal. That's typically who's wearing a mask and intruding into my home versus, who's a law enforcement official. So, I mean, it goes back a long way when it comes to, police not wanting to be accountable. And, but, there was lessons learned over the last 200 years that we would hope would remind ICE agents and Border Patrol that there's some benefit to wearing uniforms and identifying yourself in these procedures for them. And so when I see, DHS secretary go out and talk about all the ICE agents who've been assaulted over the last year, and it's just incredible how many people are resisting them and all of this stuff. And look, there's been some legitimate instances of that. Much of it is actually instances where DHS agents are provoking the encounter and attacking a civilian who's recording them and different things like that. But even in the cases where there is some pushback, there's actually some kind of assault happening on the officer, I am left with the impression that they don't think that any policy that they do could reduce those assaults, that it's just baked into the left's reaction, or, just whatever, some conspiracy that they have against ICE. Well, in my view, if they change their policies to make their enforcement operation more representative of how we expect law enforcement to be carried out, they would face less resistance. And so, just want your reaction to that. Do you see that? Is there some legitimate reason to be concerned that as police move further and further away from seeing themselves as police as opposed to, a military raid, that, it provokes more resistance than we would otherwise have?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does. I mean, you want to build trust in the communities that you're policing. I mean, when you're arresting people who are showing up to court for hearings like they're supposed to and following the law, what are you encouraging? You're encouraging people to stop showing up for court. You're encouraging people to stop respecting law enforcement and to stop respecting the process. But I think, the masking, I think you touched on something that's really important. When I was researching my first book, the Warrior Cop book, I interviewed a lot of police chiefs and police chiefs from several different eras. And one of the chiefs I interviewed was this guy, Jerry Wilson, who was the police chief in D.C. in the early 70s. And the Nixon administration was trying to impose Nixon's preferred crime policies on D.C. as sort of his test city, right? Sounds a little familiar, right? And Wilson didn't want any of it. He did not believe in no-knock raids, which is something that Nixon was pushing. He did not believe in really aggressive responses to protests that like Nixon was pushing. And so Wilson kind of refused this, and he refused the kind of the federal funding that came with it. And when I asked him about, there are a lot of protests in DC, obviously, and the city has figured out how to police them in a way that respects the right to express yourself, but also, protects public safety. And what he said was that when you tell your officers that their job is not to protect the city from the protesters, when you tell them that their job is to enforce the protesters' right to express themselves, right? Not only do you have police that then don't go to a protest expecting violence, right? They're going to treat the protesters better because you're telling them that they're human beings. But also you send them out in their uniforms, right? Because when you send them out in the riot gear from day one, not only have you sort of dehumanized the protesters in the eyes of the police, the police have become these maskless masked sort of faceless representations of everything that they hate and that they're protesting against, right? It's not Sergeant Brown with a name tag who has, blue eyes and a mustache and, a couple kids. It's this like sort of RoboCop looking representation of, the fascist state that you're protesting. And over the years, I mean, I found that if you look at the Occupy protest, if you look at the George Floyd protest, the police departments that responded, the Ferguson protest, if you look at the police departments that responded to protests in this way where protesters are citizens with rights, that is our responsibility. It's to protect their constitutional right to express themselves, not as they're this problem that we have to deal with or eliminate it. Those cities tended to have less violence. Those cities tended to have, fewer arrests, fewer assaults on police officers. And I think that lesson applies to what you're talking about with ICE right now. I mean, they are sending people out in masks because, it intimidates, it terrorizes, but also, the effect, the dehumanization effect, the dehumanization effect isn't just in the minds of police on the immigrant communities, right? It dehumanizes the immigration officers in the eyes of the people where they're being deployed. They are now the masked, faceless representations of everything they hate. And so, yeah, I think it works both ways. I think the problem with us making this argument is that I think this administration wants violence. I think they want these kinds of incidents. I think they want a flare up because they want to send in the military. Trump has always wanted to send in the military. I think he wants an excuse to send the National Guard into Minneapolis. And so us saying, well, you're actually making this more dangerous for these immigration officers by masking them and having them engage in these aggressive tactics, I don't think they care.
When I look at the training in some of these situations, it, in Minnesota, this recent shooting, when you look at what the officers did to put themselves in harm's way by standing in front of the vehicle the way that he did, by refusing to back away when the vehicle starts moving. I mean, these are tactics and things that I would not expect to see from local police. I mean, I'm no expert on this, but when you see it, someone gets pulled over, they tell them to turn the vehicle off before they approach the car. This is, it's beyond a point where training could fix this. But I also think whatever they are being trained to do is not to de-escalate, protect themselves, protect the public. It's to confront, attack, assail. And that, to me, is such a big part of the problem, is if you want to have orderly policing and respect for your authority, you're not going to engage in behaviors that are inherently dangerous. And whatever you think of how that, whether she's a protester or an observer or just a random person behaved, I mean, I wouldn't have behaved how she did. I would not have driven off with officers hanging off my car. I wouldn't have done that. But the idea that the officer is trained to then pull out his weapon and think of her as an imminent threat to him, who really, it's better if she gets shot than if she gets away, is what I interpret, what I see when he's standing in front of the vehicle. And then when it starts to move back and then forward, he doesn't move, he pulls out his gun. And I think that's a real problem. And I'm wondering what you think of when you think about the training that goes in for police. Is there a training? Could training improve the situation at all, or is it maybe that it's intentional bad training here?
I think it's intentional that there's no training or very little training. I mean, we've seen them scale back the training for immigration officers dramatically because they have to hire so many to get to their goals. They're lowering the requirements to become an immigration officer, and the Border Patrol already has a long and kind of sordid history in terms of abuse of force, abuse of power. somebody just pointed out, and I completely forgotten about this. The Nation magazine, and actually several publications about 7 or 8 years ago, had long reports about how Border Patrol officers were shooting into cars, shooting into moving cars, and they were putting themselves in front of vehicles of people who were trying to flee and then shooting the people inside. Why was that a story? Because that is bad policy. That is bad training. Most big city police departments prohibit officers from shooting into moving vehicles for the very simple reason that it doesn't stop the vehicle when you kill the driver. It continues going forward. So if you were in the line of if you were in the line of a vehicle moving towards you, the advice, across police training in most police training organizations across the country is you should spend all of your energy and muscle, and you should train your muscle memory toward getting out of the way. That's what you do. There's really no reason to ever shoot into a moving car. The only thing I can think of is if you had an attack like the one in Nice, France a while back, where someone was literally using a vehicle to commit mass murder, right? And was backing up and mowing down crowds of people. Yes, then shooting the operator would probably be the best tactic. That's also extremely rare. Again, I've been writing about this stuff for 20 years. I've written about a lot of cases where police have killed somebody in a moving vehicle. I'm sure it's happened, but I don't think there's a single case I've written about or read about where I think the person was intentionally trying to kill a police officer. I think overwhelmingly they're trying to flee. They're trying to get away. And shooting them, may stop them from getting away. But putting yourself in front of the vehicle and then killing them because they were coming at you, one, puts the officer at risk. It puts everybody nearby at risk because now you have a vehicle with nobody at the wheel that could be, careening out of control, which is exactly what happened in Minneapolis. They crashed into a parked car. Luckily, there was nobody inside. It is reckless policy. I don't know if this officer was trained in the proper way to handle these situations, but a lot of police departments tell officers not to block escape routes when they pull someone over, right? Because particularly, and unless it's an escaped fugitive or somebody who you think has is about to kill someone, is violent. It's better to escape them than to put officers at risk and put people nearby at risk. So everything we see in these videos is really bad training. The New York Times pointed out today that the officer did put himself in front of the vehicle. He's seen in another video running up the passenger side, and then he fires from in front of the car and then from the driver's side. So he clearly crossed in front of the vehicle over a period of just a few seconds. Incredibly, when he's running up the passenger side, he's also holding up his cell phone recording. He's got his gun in one hand and a cell phone in the other. Now, probably, as you know, what he was doing there is using this facial recognition technology where ICE is now recording protesters to create a database of faces. I guess we could ask kind of the public, is that worth, is that database worth one, a lot of civil liberties implications in and of itself. But, we're told all the time that these officers have to make split-second decisions and process information really quickly. We know that just being on your cell phone is a major distraction if, for example, you're driving, right? So I think it's fair to ask, was the fact that this officer was recording on his cell phone while this incident went down, did that, perhaps cloud his judgment as to what was actually going on? Did it maybe cause him to perceive a threat where there probably wasn't one? I mean, he was the only officer who opened fire. So I think that's a legitimate question to ask. But again, as is often the case with this administration, we have to ask whether what's happening here is incompetence or deliberate sort of nefariousness, right? I mean, are they not training these officers because they have to hire too many and it's too expensive? Or are they not training these officers because they want to terrorize these communities? And one way of doing that is to, tell these officers that there are no rules and then kind of do whatever they want.
Yeah, a quick data point on this is if you look at the increase in the number of arrests that are made outside of prisons, jails, other government sites, police stations, it's basically 1,000% increase in these types of arrests. So ICE went from a situation where this was extraordinarily rare, highly planned operations by highly trained subset of ICE agents to a situation where every ICE agent is expected to go out on the street and come home with dozens of people in the back of their truck or their van in order to justify their employment for ICE. And so I think we've seen a radical change in what they're doing, their tactics and how they're behaving and who they're targeting and how they're targeting them, because it's mass deportation. It's, this is the core of the myth, is they're not going after the criminals. They're not going after the public safety threats. They're going out in communities trying to identify random people, largely through racial profiling, but also through mass surveillance and other means. If you talk about the racial profiling bit of this, I mean, that to me is what is driving so much of the protesters and the interactions between the public. Is you're out on the streets, you're detaining someone explicitly because of who they are, because what they look like, the type of job they're doing, their race, how they speak. And then the public sees this. If you're a witness, a passerby, someone who's observing this interaction, you think, this isn't right. This is unjustified. I'm going to get in there and say it's unjustified. And all of a sudden you have this resistance that's happening. And so I'm wondering whether you have any experience with that at the state and local level when it comes to racial profiling, and how they handle it there, and what your thoughts are on that element of it. Is, this is really, it's not just random stops. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. There's no actual basis or evidence that this person that they're approaching is in the country illegally, but it is actually targeted toward a certain demographic. And, I don't know, what are your thoughts about how that's playing out and how that interacts with some of the policing practices that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say it's un-American, but unfortunately, it's all too American, right? We'd like to think that we don't collectively punish, right? We don't say that because you're a member of this group, that we think does this in disproportionate numbers, we're going to hold you responsible for what other members of that group do. But we do that. I mean, there's racial profiling. The joke among cops is that about racial profiling is that it never happens and it works, right? And so, we saw it in the Supreme Court decision in Kavanaugh's concurrence, which was basically saying, most immigrants I'm paraphrasing, of course, but, look foreign and speak kind of foreign and hang out in certain places. And so therefore, there's nothing wrong with police looking for immigrants in those spaces, looking for undocumented people in those spaces. But, it has profoundly bad effects on these communities. We saw during the Trump administration, there were studies done showing that in cities where you had cooperation between local police and federal immigration officers, there were fewer domestic violence calls to police. You had police chiefs in some cities saying that when ICE came to their city, there were fewer 911 calls from immigrant neighborhoods. There was less cooperation. People stopped testifying as witnesses at trial. They're just less. People are less trustful of government and law enforcement when they have to fear government and law enforcement. I mean, it's not any more complicated than that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of I just had a list that I quickly put together of what I thought here are the abuses that we're seeing. We talked about, systematic attacks on ICE observers, denial of the right to record, calling them domestic terrorists if they so much as, stand in the way or demand, where's the warrant? We've seen a lot of that. Arrests of non-citizens and visa holders and others for First Amendment protected speech. I think this puts us right on the road to passport pleas for any speech the government doesn't like. They can demand your passport now to prove that you have the right to criticize their foreign policy or their other positions. We mentioned the surveillance state. the social media vetting piece of that is, I think, underrated in terms of its totalitarian implications, because if you're scanning everyone's social media for opinions that would result in the non-citizens denial, if you have any relation to any non-citizens, I certainly work with many who are on visas or in the green card process here at the Cato Institute. I have family members who might be in relationships with people who are non-citizens. Any connection between what you say and a non-citizen who could be deported as a result of your beliefs, or if they express support for your beliefs in some way, I think that's one thing that's really on the same page as what you're talking about, this totalitarian shift where immigration isn't about immigration anymore. It's about policing people's opinions and controlling the population. The birthright citizenship order, it hasn't gone into effect, but you look at the videos of them demanding to know, where were you born? If you say U.S., sometimes they leave you alone. But if the birth certificate is no longer proof of your right to be in the United States, all of a sudden it's opening up a whole new level of interrogation and ability to detain and threaten. And if you combine that with the First Amendment attacks, then you have another layer of, okay, the social media vetting is producing some results that show that you have the wrong opinion. I can go demand to see if you're a citizen, but you can't prove it with your birth certificate anymore. And in fact, I couldn't prove it with any of my documents. I don't have my parents' documents. Another one on my list is violations of private property. We've seen that consistently. Border Patrol, ICE, just rampaging through a neighborhood, over fences and yards and into homes. Even this is maybe one that you could riff on. The attacks on the independence of the state and local police has been unrelenting, because if your whole goal is to control everything that happens, all the control in one individual, in the president of the United States, then you want to obliterate New York City and Chicago and Minneapolis and DC. We already saw it with DC. They've eliminated their independence. But if you eliminate all these state and local independence, then you can control the day-to-day operations and policing everywhere in the country. So we've seen multiple lawsuits against their refusal to cooperate with ICE. Attacks on the courts. You had a little bit in there on them lying to courts, but they've also been ignoring the courts, been publicly denouncing their independence and saying they have no right to tell us how to engage in policing and so forth. The relocation of all federal law enforcement into this immigration operation, you have a little bit on that, but I mean, the whole idea here is now anyone, any kind of organ of the federal government could be a deportation agent who could detain you without due process for any reason he wants. And then, of course, the imprisonment without due process in El Salvador. You do mention that in the article, and I think that's a big one, because if they can start sending people who protest them or have opinions or are from the wrong country, not just out of the country, but straight into a prison camp where we never hear from them for months or years, the amount of abuses there are just incredible to think about. And then, of course, the threats to revoke people's citizenship is just ever present every day. Elon was threatened. Rosie O'Donnell, I mean, she was actually born in this country, threatened to take away her citizenship. These are all, you might say they're in vain, they're fake threats. He doesn't really mean it. He threatened to send citizens to El Salvador. Maybe it's a joke. But then you look at what he's already done in terms of taking away our rights and undermining the Constitution. You have to wonder, is this the direction it goes in? So I just wanted to put that list out there and have you riff on anything you wanted to riff on and give you the floor to talk about some of that.
Yeah. Oh, I think the freedom of expression, the free speech aspect of it is like you said, that's really important because immigration is being used as a weapon to crack down on speech the government doesn't like. And we saw this early on when, they started revoking those student visas to people over, comments about Gaza. We saw, literally masked agents abduct a woman off the street and detain her over an op-ed she wrote in a student newspaper. And now with the combination of the denaturalization office that apparently, and this is also long been a goal of Stephen Miller, this idea of mass denaturalization of people who already are U.S. citizens, and you combine that with the free speech element of this, and you get situations where like members of Congress are calling for New York Mayor Mamdani to be denaturalized and deported. Why? Because they don't agree with his policies, right? They don't agree with what he's saying. They don't agree with the, his politics. That is, fundamentally un-American. That is, cuts right at the core of what we profess to be about. And I would also, the other issue I'd bring up that I think is inherent in a lot of what you said, a lot of the list that you just gave, is, the rights complete and utter abandonment of federalism, right? This idea that, states are laboratories of democracy. I've always been a big fan of the 14th Amendment, and I think that, we need an active federal government to stop states from violating people's constitutional rights. But beyond that, I think if states want to give people more freedom than the federal government does, that's fine. They should be able to do that. But they don't, that's not what Trump was about, right? Trump was about imposing his will on the entire country. And so states that don't do what he wants risk getting, federal funding cut off for various projects. If you don't assist federal law enforcement officers in immigration enforcement, they're trying to cut off funds for that too, and that's still an issue that needs to be litigated by the courts. Just today in Minnesota, you had and this is some reporting that I did, according to some sources I have in Minneapolis, but initially the FBI had agreed to work with the Tennessee State Police Bureau, which is called the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, to allow for a separate state investigation of the Renee Good killing, possibly to bring state charges because one, it's a state crime. If a crime was committed, if this was a homicide, that is a state crime. And what happened was the U.S. attorney, Daniel Rosen in Minnesota, intervened and told the FBI not to cooperate with any state or local law enforcement agency. And so now the FBI will not be sharing any of the evidence that's collected in this case, includes all the crime scene processing or alleged crime scene processing, interviews with witnesses. And that ought to cut at the heart of anybody who claims to believe in federalism, right? States should be able to hold federal law enforcement agents accountable when they commit actual crimes in those states. If this was a crime, this officer needs to be prosecuted. And I think, the citizens of Minnesota and Minneapolis had the right to have their own elected representatives conduct their own investigation, their own public officials into what happened. Particularly when you've got an FBI that has been as politicized as this one has, overseeing the investigation. So, I think that is an important issue where the right has just kind of turned tail and run during the Trump era. This idea that states, are laboratories of democracy and should have the freedom to kind of pursue their own policies.
All right. Why don't we talk about, to conclude here, the pushback that these policies have received. And you can look at it from different levels. The opposition party here in Congress, they shut down the government to make sure that, healthcare subsidies got extended. Not a peep so far about, mass racial profiling and the other unconstitutional actions we've been talking about. How do you see the political opposition at the elected level, whether state and local, federal, versus the people, the public's reaction to what they're seeing, and do you feel some confidence that the public is not on board with what we're seeing?
Yeah, I think this is the one area where I have some optimism right now. What we saw in Chicago, where you had neighborhoods mobilizing and becoming active and creating communication networks. You had people volunteering to walk immigrant kids home from school so that they wouldn't be confronted by ICE. And you had people letting, Facebook groups letting people know when ICE was not at someplace like Home Depot and it was safe to go there. You had people delivering groceries to immigrant families who were afraid to leave their homes. You had the whistle brigades warning people when ICE was in the neighborhood. I mean, I found it actually really kind of inspiring and somewhat invigorating in doing the research and reporting for an article that really was uh, kind of traumatic to report out. I mean, I'm not going to say I suffered trauma anywhere near what people who are actually on the ground suffered. But it was, it was a mentally sort of taxing article to write because it required watching a lot of these videos and reading about a lot of these cases where people were abused and were suffering. So I mean, one of the people I interviewed is actually somebody I know, is a friend of mine from law school who was not particularly political, never been particularly political. I've known him forever. And all of a sudden I start seeing, on Facebook, these very kind of militant, like, ICE out of our neighborhood, posting, instructions to neighbors about where they can pick up whistles, go into this restaurant and ask, they're kind of giving them out. Just watching people who were just angry at seeing the way that their neighborhoods were being denigrated. I mean, they tear gassed an entire neighborhood right before there was supposed to be a children's Halloween parade, right? They made people afraid to go out. They completely shut down, business and commerce in some of these areas and some of these neighborhoods. It took a real hit to the economy in some of these places. And so, people were mad about it. They were mad that this was coming to the communities, but they were also mad because they didn't like what they were seeing done to the people who live around them and the people who they share these communities with. One of the videos that they moved on to Charlotte, when Trump sent the immigration officers there was a video of a bunch of high school kids shouting down a bunch of ICE agents who had chased a couple of people into a woods, and the ICE agents retreated. They left. And I found that really inspiring, where you had these kids, kind of sticking up for these people. That is, where it's at. I mean, we have seen one of the stories of this second Trump term is the mass sort of institutional failure, the lack of a backbone in our universities, law firms, media, all the way down the line. But the really inspiring thing is watching regular people stand up and say, I'm not going to let this happen in my neighborhood. I'm not going to let this happen on my street. I've seen people protest, out carrying signs, posting pictures themselves carrying signs on social media, who would never have you probably have never protested a day in their life. And me, I mean, I'm inspired by these protests, and I'm not somebody who has, been a, sign carrying kind of person. I mean, one, because I'm a journalist, but also, activism has never been my thing, but, I think that's to my discredit. I mean, I think, activism, I'm like you, I would call myself a libertarian, and it was protests that in part brought down part of the Iron Curtain, right? And so I think it is us, I think, who's going to save us, if anyone does, if we get out of this. It's going to be people taking to the streets. It's going to be people reclaiming their neighborhoods and people sticking up for one another.
Now that they've killed someone, do you think that that's going to deter people, or is it going to result in more people taking to the streets?
Well, I mean, it's not the first person they've killed. They killed a father in Chicago in a very actually similar looking case. He had just dropped his kids off at school as well, and was trying to flee. He happened to be an undocumented immigrant, unlike Mrs. Good. I don't know. I think the fact that she was a U.S. citizen, the fact that she was a mom of, I think, 3 or 4 kids, that she, may have been sort of looking out for, her neighbors, or may have just been sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time, will probably make her more sympathetic to people. I mean, we've already seen some activism on her behalf. It's always hard to say what brings people out. I mean, I never would have guessed that, the George Floyd case of all the unjust police killings over the years, that would be the one that inspires the biggest protest in U.S. history, I believe. So, I don't know. I hope so. I hope that this case, and the way that the administration has reacted to it, the just absolutely unhinged, effort to, call her a domestic terrorist, to say that she deliberately ran over an ICE agent when it's clear that didn't happen. I hope that inspires some anger in people. But I will say this too, though. We have to realize what they're doing here when they put out those kinds of statements that are not just lies, but are easily disproven lies. So, lies that are, North Korea type lies. They are not lying in those cases because they're trying to cover something up, right? You only lie like that. You don't lie like that because you're trying to get away with something. You lie like that because you're saying we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, and there's nothing you can do about it. That I think is what they think, or at least what they want us to think. I think it's up to us to show them that that isn't the case.
Well, Radley, I really appreciate your time. We've spoken for a long time, and you can find all Radley's work on his site, The Watch. And it's great chatting with you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks.